Hello, welcome to Fruition's Lockdown Learning Series. I'm Rob Foley, I'm one of the Senior Managing Consultants at Fruition IT, and today I'm joined by Chris Taylor of Yorkshire Twist, who will be discussing through how to build resilient websites, which is very topical. I'm kind of thankful that lazy spas went down during the hot weather, otherwise I'd be the proud owner of a spa, which I would not use, but it's obviously very topical, and Chris has kindly agreed to share his thoughts. For those of you that don't know, Fruition are an IT recruitment consultancy. We're based in Leeds, we're also an IT consultancy. We very much believe in a community-led approach to business and giving something back, especially during these difficult times. Our lockdown series now has been really successful. This is our 12th event, and we're going to continue to do them pretty much every week throughout. So if any of you have a topic that you would like to discuss in the future, then please let me know. Just a brief intro to Chris. Chris is a software consultant. His career spans 20 years. For the last 7 years, he's been a contractor, helping many companies with his expert domain knowledge. So that's it. I mean, Chris, if you'd like to kick off, feel free to send any questions into the speech bubble. Chris will try and answer them as he goes, but there will be an opportunity at the end for you to ask direct questions to Chris. So thanks a lot, Chris. Are you good to go?
Yeah, I certainly am. Let me just share my screen. Great, can everyone see that then?
Yes.
Have you got that? Cool, okay, let's get cracking. There's quite a lot to cover in this talk. I've decided to go broad and relatively deep, so I'm going to be going fairly quickly, but all of these slides with all the links are going to be available at the end. I'll put them on my website. Maybe Rob can add a link somewhere as well, something like that. So I guess most people here are involved professionally in the development of software, and most of the time that means stuff which is on or uses the internet, particularly the web. But we all know just as well as the average punter that the web isn't the nirvana of user experience it's cracked up to be. Why? How can we make it better? That's what we're going to explore in this talk. But first, let's define what we mean by resilience. The dictionary definition has nothing to do with the web, so let's try to paraphrase it a bit so we have a handle on it in terms of websites. Okay, so this is the definition I'll be using. The ability for a site to encounter unexpected conditions yet not fail the user. It sounds great, right? We all know that unexpected conditions occur all the time on the web. We'll be looking at some of those in some depth in a minute. So if a site can recover from those and bounce back and not fail the user, that's got to be a good thing, right? And these unexpected conditions normally result in a sucky experience for our users and our customers. So if we can mitigate those unexpected conditions, reduce the suck, we'll end up with happier users and improve the bottom line. Okay, these conditions are sometimes they're out of our control, but more often than not, they're actually in our control. We could do something about them, so we should. Because when we make stuff for the web, we make stuff that could affect and help millions of people. So we should be responsible with that power. So wherever we can control how our sites respond to unexpected conditions, we should do so. Now we're going to be looking at some data from the HTTP archive, which has been gathering this kind of info for well over a decade now. And their yearly web almanac offers some fascinating insights into a huge amount of data. So the first aspect we're going to look at is networks, or as some people call them, notworks. So we all know that network speeds are getting faster. Many of us here will have moved from 3G to 4G on our mobile devices, some perhaps even to 5G. And on desktop, many of us are on fibre broadband, perhaps even fibre to the home for those lucky people. But does the web feel fast most of the time? Nah. The Nielsen-Norman Group, who have been doing research into user experience since about 1998, have analysed the data from the HTTP archive to pull out a few sobering facts. This first graph here shows that in the US, although desktop speeds are getting faster and faster every year, the median page load time has stayed relatively static. And on mobile, the situation is even worse. Median page load time has actually got slower over the last 10 years, despite us having faster connections to our mobiles than we had to our desktops just a few years ago. Now, the median load time for pages here is measured in seconds. So yeah, that's right. Last year it was approaching 20 seconds. I'm sure that will ring true for a lot of people. Often the web just feels slow. So what does that mean for users? Well, they think that the site sucks. And at this point, we should recognise that actually there's a lot of moving parts which go into delivering a web page over a network. For mobile devices, network coverage and latency and congestion all play a major part. And this data from OpenSignal shows that even close to a big city like Leeds, there are plenty of weak or dead spots. And if we travel to the beautiful Yorkshire coast, which I love, the situation is even worse. And the biggest problem with networks is that we assume they're going to work. Work is in the word, isn't it? We assume they're going to be relatively predictable and consistent, but they just aren't, mobile networks in particular. This is one of my favourite quotes from Tim Cadlick. Every assumption introduces another way that my site can break. It's true. These assumptions that we make are bad. They're bad for us, they're bad for our sites, bad for our clients and users and customers. Every assumption, especially assumptions about the network, is just a fingers crossed wish for the best. Now, we can't do much about making the actual network connection between our users and our sites better, but we can definitely change how we use that connection. So let's move on to another subject over which we have no control, devices. Now, in most circumstances, we have absolutely no control over what devices people use to access websites. And we hope, that is, we assume that most people are on a reasonably new Apple or Android device. And if your audience is mainly young, mainly middle class, mainly urban people, then you may well be partly right. But there are a lot of people who use devices you or I wouldn't want to be stuck with. Now, worldwide sales data from 2019 shows that Android has a market share 3 times bigger than Apple. Is this what you expected? Well, that's worldwide, so it includes a bunch of countries where paying the Apple premium isn't really an option. So how about just Europe? So we switch to Europe, and Apple only have a 5% bigger market share. So for users and customers based in Europe, which for most of us, that's who we deal with, this is the reality. It's mainly Android devices. Now, it's true that mobiles are getting faster, or at least that the top end ones are. Alex Russell from Google has done amazing research into the performance of mobile devices. I highly recommend you check out his presentation, which is linked from this slide. But even top-end devices only use a fraction of their power, and then only for a fraction of the time. And why? Well, heat. If you ran a decent mobile device for any length of time at full power, then basically the device would become as hot as a light bulb in your hand. So device manufacturers do loads of trickery inside devices to ensure that the hot bits basically run as little as possible. And most people don't have top-end devices. Remember, we're all kind of affluent geeks. We're power users, generally with money to spend on expensive phones. We search for things like best smartphone 2020. Most people don't. So according to the Standard newspaper, the best-selling smartphone in 2019 was the Samsung Galaxy A50. In fact, there are only 2 Apple devices in the top 10. So what do we see if we compare the specs of that A50 to the iPhone XR, which was the iPhone model launched around the same time? Looks okay. The Samsung has an octa-core processor and the Apple has a hexa-core processor, and there's not much in terms of megahertz between them. A few little bit of differences, same kind of RAM. But if we look at the actual Geekbench scores, which measures the performance, well, the Apple just wipes the floor with the Samsung, basically. This is just one example, but there are countless others. The spectrum of Android devices out there is huge, and even mid-range ones like the A50 are no match for the top-end devices many of us working in the web development industry have in our pockets. In fact, according to Alex Russell, many popular phone models now have the same performance as top-of-the-line models from nearly a decade ago. Let's go back to that graph that we showed a minute ago. Now check out that Nokia 2 down in the bottom right there. It was released in June 2019 and it cost £94 on Amazon, and it has the same performance as an iPhone 4 or Galaxy S3. Now, as manufacturers look for more ways to sell devices, especially in emerging markets, these low-end devices are just going to become more and more common. Now, if a user with one of these devices visits your website, and which you've tested and it works great on your iPhone 11 or your Galaxy S10 or something, and they have a bad, janky experience, what do they think? Well, they think the site sucks. And what's the part of your site that's going to choke these slower devices? Yeah, it's the language everyone loves to hate or hates to love. It's JavaScript. Now, we all know JavaScript's a big part of the web these days, but JavaScript, unlike a lot of other assets such as images, it requires parsing and executing before it actually does anything. So what effect does all that processing have on page performance? Well, let's go back to the HTTP archive data. So they found that the processing time for scripts varies wildly, with the median around 849 milliseconds on desktop and 2.4 seconds on mobile. Now think about that, that's 2.4 seconds of nothing, essentially. In terms of web page performance, that's an eternity. The 90th percentile is over 10 seconds on mobile. Now that's a whole lot of waiting around for users. So where does all this JavaScript come from? Well, it comes mainly from third parties. And every connection to a third party means not only do your users have to parse and execute their scripts, but you're putting the performance of your pages at the mercy of other sites over whom you have little or no control. And that's assuming all these scripts play nicely together. Now, what if things go wrong? What if there are clashes? What if dependencies fail to load or scripts fail to parse or execute correctly? Jerry Jones, a developer at Automatic, put it like this: love like you've never been heard, dance like no one is watching, code like JavaScript is going to fail. Now, Automatic, by the way, is the people who develop WordPress, which powers, by some counts, over 30% of all websites, so they know a thing or two about scale. Now, this dependency on JavaScript is fashionable at the moment, I'll admit it. Now, Tim Cadlake, who we heard a quote from earlier, did some analysis on HTTP archive data and found some startling facts. He compared sites that use jQuery, Angular, React, and Vue. And here you can see that the number of bytes of JavaScript sent to mobile devices varies a lot. Angular kind of sticks out a little bit there, doesn't it? But it's the processing time where things really get scary. All these milliseconds spent on parsing and executing JavaScript. It's just more evidence to show that you shouldn't believe that everyone has the same experience as you on your fast device when visiting sites using frameworks like these. Many, perhaps even most people, have a quite slow and janky experience. But the use of JavaScript that really confuses me is when it's entirely unnecessary. Here's a really current example, right? The coronavirus dashboard from GovUK. Anyone seen this? Yeah, it relies on JavaScript. Okay, fine. But here's the thing: the data on the page is updated about once per day. So instead of this error message, perhaps they should have shown something like this. Slightly sarky, admittedly. Now, I've seen too many examples of static content relying on hugely complex and powerful front-end frameworks where a set of HTML pages would have done the job. Which is why Matthew Somerville, a developer from Birmingham, did a version of the coronavirus dashboard, which is just HTML, enhanced with a bit of JavaScript. On a desktop, his version is 87% smaller than the official GovUK site, but provides essentially the same data and functionality. Okay, there are actual errors, genuine production runtime bugs. So it's kind of hard to do this over a video, but hands up if you've never seen a JavaScript error in the wild. I'm guessing there's no hands, right? Okay, this is one I saw a few years ago, which I've used ever since as an example of the worst time for a JavaScript error to happen. As a customer, in this case me, was about to purchase something. Now, a normal person, by which I mean someone who doesn't browse the web with DevTools open, would click repeatedly on the button and then eventually give up in despair. What's the outcome for that user? Yeah, of course, they think the site sucks. Now, clearly, there's a lot we can do to fix many of these performance problems. One of the ways is just to send less stuff down the wire to the user. So yeah, we're going to get on to assets, or as some people call them, liabilities. And you'll see why. one of the reasons web pages are slow is because of the assets that people have to download. So let's dive back into the HTTP archive data. From the data gathered in 2019, the HTTP archive found that most web pages have a total page weight, taking into account scripts and images, CSS, everything else, of multiple megabytes. On our beefy desktops, we lose track of just how huge a megabyte is in terms of raw data. Now, did you know, for example, that the complete works of Shakespeare consists of about 3.5 million characters, which is about 3.4 meg. So let's make that clear. 25% of web pages are larger than the complete works of Shakespeare. And this huge size is increasing year on year. The change for the heaviest sites has increased by more than 350k in the year from 2018 to 2019. Now, one thing I really hate, and I guess you do too, is when you think a page has finished loading, so you try to click or press on something, but then the page jumps because the layout shifts as more assets or something affecting the layout has been downloaded. That really makes my blood boil. In fact, Ericsson found that the stress caused by waiting for slow web pages on a mobile device is comparable to watching a horror movie. Now, when it comes to assets, what are the kind of unexpected conditions we might encounter? Well, here's a non-exhaustive list. So in some of these cases, we could do our best to ensure they can't happen, but in some cases, we've kind of got no control, really. And what's the outcome for users when they wait ages for stuff to download or any of these errors occur? Of course, they think the site sucks. Now, all of these different aspects of performance are clearly a big problem, right? But there's another unexpected condition which degrades the experience users have of our site. And that unexpected condition is the needs of the user for the site to be accessible. Now, I'm not really talking about advanced stuff. Even the basics are being missed too often. Let's have a look at the data again. So the Web Almanac highlights the scale of this problem, showing even something as simple as Semantic HTML, in this case the 6 heading levels, aren't actually used on many sites. The headings, along with other landmark HTML elements, help people who use assistive technologies such as screen readers to navigate the page. Or they also help search engines understand the structure of the page. So you can put a tick in the box for SEO as well there. Now, after all, the full range of HTML elements isn't really that hard to learn. A 2-year-old could probably do it. I've got to thank Bruce Lawson for correlating these two facts. Okay, so let's look at something simpler to do with accessibility. So everyone knows that all attributes need to be added to images, yeah? Yet many pages don't. And what about visual accessibility? Well, color contrast is really important, not just for our users and customers, but for ourselves as well. Eyesight gets worse in humans as they age. The ability to distinguish between different colors reduces. Now, it might not be fashionable, but increasing color contrast can even save battery life on mobiles because users don't need to turn the screen contrast up as much to be able to make those, to distinguish between the foreground and background colors. Now, I won't dwell on accessibility too much longer, but I've got a whole other talk about that if anyone's interested. I do want to say that increasing the accessibility of your pages benefits everyone in the same way that increasing the accessibility of a physical space, in this case, getting on or off a train, benefits more than just people with disabilities. This is catering for the human needs of people using our site, whether they have visual or physical disabilities or any of a wide range of cognitive problems. And the other reason to address accessibility, of course, is the law. The Equality Act 2010 in the UK gives clear guidance to service providers, which includes businesses with a website or app, to make reasonable adjustments for disabled persons. Now, what happens if we fail to provide an accessible experience for users? Well, you guessed it, they think the site sucks. Now, you might be thinking at this point, well, does it matter? What effect does a few performance or accessibility problems actually have on users? Well, there's a great website that tells us about the effects that these things have. We'll start with performance. WPOstats.com, web performance optimization stats. They collect all kinds of examples showing the effect of web performance for all kinds of different organizations. So let's run through a few of them here so we can get to grips with it. Ancestry.com, 7% increase in conversions after improving render time and reducing page weight. So reduce render time, reduce page weight, increase conversions. Misguided, removed a third party, a bizarre voice, and improved page load time by 4 seconds. Unbelievable. A revenue increased by 26%. So be careful of those third parties that you add onto your pages. The train line reduced latency by not very much really, and customers spent an extra 8 million. I really like this one. There was a quote from the manager who was responsible for making this change. And he said that he got pushback from the train line marketing department saying people don't care about performance. They just care about discounts and adverts and blah, blah, flashy whiz-bang stuff. And after this happened, he went back to him and said, actually, 8 million quid's worth of customers care about performance, which must have been a real in-your-face moment. Okay, and here's the big one for me. DoubleClick by Google found that 53% of mobile visitors abandoned if the page took longer than 3 seconds to load. 3 seconds. Users are going to abandon your site if it's too slow. There's another one, big one. Amazon, 1% decrease in revenue for every 100 millisecond increase in load time. And now I could go on, but you get the picture. WPOstats.com is full of this kind of stuff. Company after company, organization after organization have found that improving performance that is handling the unexpected conditions that their sites encounter consistently improves business metrics. Now, some of these studies are from a while ago, as you can see, but I think you'll agree with me that good performance isn't going to go out of style anytime soon. Okay, let's move on to accessibility. Firstly, the number of people that have a long-term illness or impairment or disability in the UK is probably much higher than you thought. Now, many of these things affect how people use the web. For example, did you know more than 2 million people in the UK have some form of sight loss? Or that 6.8 million people are living with some form of mobility problem, which, especially for older people, affects their manual dexterity, for example, the ability to use a mouse. Now, people with disabilities and these kind of problems often rely on software or specialist hardware, such as this Braille keyboard. Now, if your site doesn't provide them with a good experience, they'll take their custom to somewhere that does. Now, the purple pound refers to the spending power of disabled households. And if your bosses, managers, whatever, don't want to make your sites accessible because it's the right thing to do or because it's the law, then maybe showing them that there's actually money on the table. Maybe that will persuade them. Okay, we've seen several examples of unexpected conditions that degrade the experience of people using our sites. These conditions can happen at any layer in the stack, right from the network all the way up to unexpected conditions with the actual user. Plus, there's all these human needs that are there. People need accessible sites. And we've seen some statistics that show all of these things directly impact the success of the site. That's a whole lot of suck. But hopefully a lot of it has rung true for many of us. We've all seen these kind of problems out there in the wild. The question is, can we fix it? I bet you thought I'd forgotten about my Bob the Builder threat. Nope, didn't forget. Okay, there are many things we can do to fix these problems and ensure our sites are more resilient to the unexpected conditions that I've described. But I've got to warn you before we get going, some of the things I'd suggest aren't fashionable. But I believe they're necessary to improve our sites and ensure they are resilient to the many different ways that sites can fail our users and customers. So I've got 6 tips to suggest for you. And the first tip is to learn how browsers work. It's always surprising to me how many developers working on the web have never looked into how the runtime environment they use actually functions. After all, the web is vastly different to server software. With desktop and server software, you either get everything or nothing. You either have the software or you don't. And when you're trying to open an old file format, you need the right version of the software. Now, many years ago, the web kind of copied this a little, this kind of all or nothing approach. Does anyone remember Flash or Shockwave or Java applets? Yeah? If you had the right plugin, you got the full experience. But if you didn't, you got absolutely nothing. It was all or nothing. Now, Milli Vanilli sang about this. I use the term sing loosely. They sang about this on their 1988 album, All or Nothing, which was included in Q Magazine's 2006 list of the 50 worst albums ever made. But all or nothing isn't really how the web works. Let's have a look at a process diagram for a browser. So this is a kind of simplified process diagram. You request a page, and that starts by getting some HTML. And if an error happens at that point, basically the first red line you see on the left-hand side there, you get a status of some kind, like a 404 or a 500, or maybe some kind of authentication error. But once you get some HTML, the browser parses it and kicks off two different pipelines, one to get and parse CSS, and the other to get and parse and execute JavaScript. Now, if errors happen during those pipelines, assets not available or script execution problems or whatever, the user still has the HTML. It's not a pretty or fancy full web page, but they get something. Now, with SPA frameworks, where content is loaded by JavaScript calls to APIs, there are more places that errors can occur. It's as simple as that. In this model, everything has to work before the user gets anything, because the script which if the script that fetches the content fails for some reason, then the user has nothing. Essentially, they have a blank page. This all or nothing approach, remember, that's the same way that Flash and Java applets works. Now, there's a lot we could do to protect against this. I don't want to do down SPA frameworks because they're great. Server rendering is a really good start, of course. But it's built into kind of the design of the web, if you like, this is simple idea that everything starts with HTML. HTML came first, both figuratively and literally. I mean, it was the only thing back in the beginning of the web. CSS and JavaScript were built to layer on top of it and enhance that. So you need to understand browsers, at least to a reasonable level, in order to build good websites. You know, you need to learn about rendering pipelines, about blocking and non-blocking resources. Now, there's loads of information out there to help you, because the reality is we don't control the execution environment that our site's running. So we should try to understand how it works so we can make our sites more resilient. The simplest practical way to get started with that is to use Semantic HTML. Groucho. Now, we've already seen there are about 140 HTML elements, so let's use them. Yeah. That means using buttons for buttons, links for links, using proper headings. Doing this not only fixes many accessibility problems, but it actually helps with search engine optimization, and it saves you writing code. For example, the functionality that's built into the humble button element here means it's focusable. It can be triggered by various different key presses that are standard, as well as the mouse, and that's all functionality that you don't have to write. Now, I'm not saying don't use div and span elements at all. They have their uses, but you should look for a more suitable element first. Now, knowing HTML isn't fashionable, but I'd argue it kind of should be, because Semantic HTML means that your pages have a flow to them, which is discoverable programmatically. Now, in this example, you can see how headings used properly allow the page to be navigated by assistive technologies. Users can skip over entire sections if they don't contain the content that they're interested in. Now, the overuse of div elements for layout is a particular bugbear of mine and many others. It's been called divitis, and you can see why. Hadouken! Almost everything you see here in this code from Facebook is a div. There's one tiny span in the middle there. Now, I get it. Okay, modern sites can be very complex, but having a huge number of DOM elements can cause real problems. In fact, Lighthouse, Google's Lighthouse tool, which we'll look at in a minute, penalizes sites where the DOM tree is too large. Now, as developers, we should get familiar with the output our systems are producing. That means we need to get good at investigation and testing. So let's look at testing. Tip 3, make testing tools your best friends. Unfortunately, there are loads of great tools to help us. The first one you already use, right? It's DevTools. Okay, DevTools in all of the major browsers are amazingly powerful. I remember the days before DevTools when you had to drop console.log calls everywhere and just hope for the best. If it wasn't for people like Chris Pederick, remember him? He paved the way by creating browser extensions for web developers. And if it wasn't for people like him, I probably would have gone absolutely nuts by now. Now, as well as all the usual features you're probably already using, like DOM inspection and adding breakpoints, DevTools offer loads of other stuff now. You can see here, such as network throttling simulation, emulation visual efficiencies, flame charts of JavaScript calls, and Edge is now bringing back the 3D view, which is great stuff. Now, built into the DevTools for Chromium-based browsers is Lighthouse. This is an automated tool for checking the quality of web pages based on a few rules set by Google. Now, it gives a good high-level view of how well a page is working in terms of performance, accessibility, and SEO. It's something you should run regularly because it's so easy to do, but as it's built into your own browser, it can only simulate network conditions. It's not really a proper test of what your users actually experience from their locations. For that, you need a tool which loads pages from different locations around the world. Fortunately, next on your list should be webpagetest.org. Now, it's not the prettiest of sites, but for testing performance, it's a free tool of absolutely astounding quality. Here I am testing my site on a Moto G device. Yep, that's a real phone plugged in Dulles in the US state of Virginia. Actual devices like this are only available from a couple of testing locations worldwide, but desktop browsers are available from dozens of different places. Now, Web Page Test shows loads of deep information about the performance of the site, and here you can see there's a couple of reds on there that I probably need to look at. But one of my favourite things that Web Page Test does is shows this film strip view. Now, the top view here is the first load of my site with an empty cache. The bottom view is the repeat view with a primed cache. Now, I've had great success showing these kind of film strips to managers and other non-technical people to show them what the performance of their sites actually looks like. And when you compare your slow site to a competitor's fast site, well, there's no better way to get buy-in for making performance improvements. So please do take a look, time to look around Web Page Test and everything it does. It can be quite daunting to a newbie, and as it's free, you sometimes have to wait in line behind a lot of other tests. But if your organisation's happy in paying a bit of money, then look at SpeedCurve. SpeedCurve, I think, is built on top of Web Page Test and allows you to set up scheduled tests, comparisons to other sites, performance budgets, we'll look at them in a minute, and much more. It's all gorgeous, perfect for putting on a dashboard, and the SpeedCurve team has some of the best performance engineers in the business. Okay, linked from Web Page Test, and which uses its results as well as a tool called Request Map. This visually shows the relationship a site has with third-party domains. Here I've tested the site for a large UK music equipment retailer, and you can see there are a whole lot more third-party calls than you might expect. Now, Request Map traces third-party calls as far as it can, which is why you see these calls kind of going off into the distance. This is why third-party calls can be a real performance killer. Think of all those network hops of everything that's been loaded. Now, it's also worth mentioning Pagespeed Insights, which is another Google tool, providing much the same information as Lighthouse, but using Google's infrastructure rather than your own browser. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the mention of Core Web Vitals. Now, Core Web Vitals is a new initiative from Google that released it last month, which tests three major aspects of performance. How quickly a page looks like it loads, which is known as largest contentful paint, how quickly a user can actually interact with it, called first input delay, and whether the layout shifts, which, as I mentioned earlier, is something that really annoys me and maybe other people as well. So all these different metrics are built into Pagespeed Insights, are built into Lighthouse and Web Page Test, so they're useful high-level set of metrics to use. Now, I mentioned testing from real devices is much better than using just a simulated network, simulated slow network and connection. So if you've got old phones lying around and you could put a pay-as-you-go SIM card in it to do some testing, that would be fantastic. Maybe your organisation is willing to pay for a few popular cheap smartphones and tablet devices to use for testing. A device lab like this can be shared between multiple teams, perhaps even multiple organisations. Okay, web performance is really easy to get into. There are loads of resources to help you and a thriving community on social media. There's even a Slack workspace at webperformance.slack.com where you can talk to other performance engineers. Sitespeed.io has loads of stuff and guides to get you started, so there's no excuse not to make your sites fast. Okay, that's a lot about testing performance. What about testing accessibility? Well, first up, I've got to mention Wave, the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. You can use it from this website that's linked from this slide here, or there are extensions from Chrome and Firefox. And displayed here as well is the Axe extension from DEC. Both will highlight common accessibility issues. For a deeper look into possible accessibility problems, you should test your pages using a screen reader. There are extensions for browsers that do this, but it's worth using one of the real ones as well. MVDA from MV Access is free and open source. Now, screen readers can be pretty daunting if you've never used one before, but persevere with them. They're incredibly useful. It's also worth trying to navigate your site using just a keyboard. That's easy to do and often really enlightening. Now, finally, most importantly, if you're serious about making your sites accessible, you should investigate testing with real users, people who use assistive technologies, who can give you the wisdom of their lived experience. Now, according to world-renowned accessibility experts, the Paciello Group, automated accessibility testing tools only catch about 30% of accessibility issues. So you need to get serious about the other 70%. Okay, tip 4, constantly question your assumptions. Earlier, we looked at assumptions about the network, but there are many other assumptions we can make. For example, we can assume about the cumulative things, browsers and devices and networks and stuff that people are using. We've seen actually from the evidence that the range of devices people use actually is really huge. And developers often assume that over time, the capabilities and quality of things like networks and browsers and everything increases, and they do, that's true. But we believe that we leave the old, outdated, slow stuff behind us in what I've called here the blessed void of obsolescence. But the tough truth of reality is that we never really leave the old stuff behind. We've seen cheap new devices, they get released, but they have the same performance profile as stuff from 10 years ago. Now, you should check the analytics for your site regularly to see whether the assumptions you make about devices and browsers and screen sizes and stuff are still valid. Do that regularly. Now, web page tests can also help with one particular assumption, the assumption that third parties can be relied on. Now, when you start a test, under the advanced section, there's a tab called SPOF, which stands for single point of failure. Here you can simulate what would happen if certain domains, for example, your CDN or a third party you'd rely on, were to fail. Yep, this is your very own Chaos Monkey. Now, Chaos Monkey, if you didn't know, is technology invented by Netflix to test how resilient their systems are. Basically, it's a bot that goes around randomly turning services off to see whether Netflix as a whole keeps running. This feature in web page test allows you to do that as well. The next tip is probably the least fashionable suggestion I'll make. Now, JavaScript's cool, it's great, but sometimes you don't need it, or at least you don't need so much of it, as we saw with the coronavirus dashboard earlier. Some sites seem to lose visibility, lose sight, if you like, of the content they're actually serving up for users. For example, what about a site that shows coupons? That's relatively static data, right? Yeah, if JavaScript fails on Groupon, you get this. It's a lovely template, but not very useful. What about an image gallery like Instagram? It's got to give the user something if JavaScript fails, right? Except it doesn't. This is what happens. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying that JavaScript is bad. It's not. I love it. I've built JavaScript libraries and frameworks myself. But relying on it too much can lead to negative outcomes for users. Now, several years ago, a team was put together to rebuild a big newspaper site in the US called the Boston Globe. It was one of the first big responsive designs. And one of the team members said this about how they use JavaScript. Lots of cool features on the Boston Globe don't work when JavaScript breaks. Reading the news is not one of them. For me, this is a really pragmatic approach. The core functionality of the Boston Globe is to show people the news. So the team made that functionality as resilient as it could be. Other features were considered enhancements. If they weren't the core functionality, so if they broke, they broke. The user still got the main thing that they came to the site for. This quote, by the way, is from the book Resilient Web Design by a guy called Jeremy Keith. It's a fantastic book, not just because it's great content, but because it's online, it's free, and the book is a progressive web app. The book practices what it preaches. Please go and have a look at it. It's linked from the slide here. Now, this isn't a fashionable view, but it's not just me saying that a total dependence on JavaScript needs to be considered very carefully. Other developers have the same opinion. For example, Dan Abramov recently said this: client-side only is not sustainable. Well, who's Dan Abramov? Well, he's the co-author of Redux and Create React App, and he works on the React team. Or there's this: majority of websites aren't and don't need to be single-page apps. Where might you find that quote? Well, it's actually on the React website itself. Now, the thing is, if we're focused on ensuring that our users are successful in what they're trying to do, which is read some content or fill in a form or search for some information, then we should code our site to make that successful outcome as likely as possible. Where appropriate, JavaScript is a great tool, right? But where it's not needed, it can cause problems for users, problems that could be avoided. Now, there's an approach kind of gaining in popularity called Jamstack. It stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. And essentially, it describes pre-rendered information, pre-rendered pages that are enhanced with judicious use of JavaScript and other APIs. And so you get all of the performance and stability of server-rendered HTML and all the whiz-bang of client-side interactivity. Now, when that's combined with a service worker, which can provide advanced caching and offline support, not to mention the ability for your site to be installed to a device, it's a really compelling approach. Now, my final tip is to create a performance culture. Now, in the same way we implement CI/CD pipelines and we automate tests to catch regression bugs at a code level, we should do the same at user experience level as well. So all of the tools I mentioned earlier help with this, but nothing beats getting close to the experience real users have with our sites. Now, that may be through a real user monitoring system or looking at web analytics. Those things are often owned by a marketing department. So you might need to bridge that gap, and talk to them about that kind of stuff. Now, one great way to start is to create a performance budget. This defines upper limits for asset sizes and various metrics to ensure you keep your site fast. The performancebudget.io tool helps you craft a budget suitable for your site, but be warned, you'll have much less to play with than you would like. Now, there's a guy called Jerry McGovern who's an absolute master at helping organisations focus on what customers actually want. If you visit his website, linked here, you can watch a selection of his talks. I guarantee you'll be glad you did. And Jerry often talks about top tasks, the things that visitors most often want to accomplish on our site. Perhaps it's find a product or download some information. Perhaps it's make an insurance claim or whatever. Whatever these top tasks are, we should strive to remove as many barriers as possible which stop the user achieving that goal. Resilience of the site, ensuring it doesn't fail the user when it encounters unexpected conditions, is a big part of that. Because this stuff matters. Performance, accessibility, this resilience I've talked about, it all matters. It matters to our users and customers. And when they're happy, we'll get better outcomes for everything that we build. Now, back in April 2000, an article was published by a guy called John Alsop on the A List Apart magazine. It was called A Tao of Web Design. It was a call to understand and design for the web medium, which at the time was still fairly young. The article is incredibly visionary. It alludes to responsive design 10 years before Ethan Markov coined the term, and it encourages us to think about different browsers and platforms and screens 6 years before the iPhone revolutionized where the web could be used. And in that article, John Alsop wrote this: the control which designers know in the print medium and often desire in the web medium is simply a function of the limitation of the printed page. We should embrace the fact that the web doesn't have the same constraints and design for this flexibility. Now, that's absolutely true, but if we paraphrase it slightly, we can make it more suitable for developers, like this. The control which developers know in the desktop medium and often desire in the web medium is simply a function of the delivery mechanism of desktop apps. We should embrace the fact that the web doesn't have the same delivery mechanism and develop for this reality. Now, if you remember back 3 or 4 weeks ago when I started this talk, I talked about an all or nothing approach, which is what you get on desktop apps and with plugins like Flash and Java applets. The web doesn't work like that. And we've seen that the layering of different technologies to build a complete web page, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, everything else, means there are many potential points of failure. But we can and should try to make our sites resilient to these unexpected conditions and not fail our users and customers. And there's a name for this mindset of building websites: progressive enhancement. Now, it basically means asking if a lot, really. If this file is missing, if this API call fails, if the browser doesn't execute the script correctly, what happens then? It's only when we consider all of those different ifs, all of those different things, that we question our assumptions, that we can truly make resilient websites. Because we as developers on the web have to expect the unexpected. Thank you. That's it from me.
Hi, Chris. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
No, it was really informative. Even I was following it. It was brilliant.
Wow. Okay.
I know a little bit.
Great.
Have we got any questions? If anybody's shy, they can just write it in the chat box, or if they're able to unmute themselves.
There are a few. Are there any questions? Thanks, Andy. Thanks for your input. Thank you, everyone. Does anyone have any questions? I've got a prize for the person asking the question that I know someone's going to ask.
Is that a new shirt?
Is that no? Not that one. No, and nobody's mentioned the haircut either. Nice COVID cuts. You know. No.
Anybody at all?
Yes. Yeah, we'll make the slides available for download. There'll be all the links in there as well. So.
Yeah, and we'll put it on YouTube as well, on our Fruition IT YouTube channel, if people want to watch it at their leisure. Nothing from anybody else?
No questions at all. Wow.
What we did have, Chris, nobody dropped off. We normally get people dropping off, and I think this is the first one where nobody has at all. So I think it was really informative. What's the question you want us to ask?
Okay, there are a couple of questions.
Yes.
What's the question you wanted us to ask? I expect someone would say, what about web apps, not sites? Notice I never talked about web apps at any point in that slide. I expected someone to say that. My answer was going to be long and complicated, but I'll skip over that. But someone did ask someone did ask a question: is reactive development instead of responsive a way to improve performance? It's a good question. I don't know. Responsive design is a way to design web pages so that they handle different screen sizes. Reactive development, I think, is an entirely different kind of fish. So maybe we're trying to compare apples to oranges there. But maybe contact me offline or something like that. We'll have a chat about it. The other one, are you a musician, Chris? PMT Online? Yes, I've just bought myself a new MIDI keyboard. That's why I was looking at that. Any thoughts about the ZK web development framework, Java-based? Sorry, never heard of it. I'm actually a .NET developer, so I don't know much about Java stuff.
There's one from Leslie there, Chris. And what about web apps? Which one's? Sorry, where's that? What about web apps? Okay, so web apps, we've got a few minutes, haven't we? Okay, web apps. So people talk about web apps like they're a different animal to websites, whereas really, they're not two different things. They're actually a continuum, right? So you have, at one end, you have your static content site, stuff that doesn't change very often, which essentially could be static HTML. And at the other end, you've got your extreme web apps like, Google Sheets or Google Maps or something like that. And when people talk about web apps, they're thinking somewhere on that continuum. So I would say, rather than say, well, let's just make a difference between a website and a web app, let's actually take each project, essentially, that we're building and look at its merits, look at what it's trying to do and say, well, how can we make this more resilient? And it may be that
in some cases, if you're building a Google Maps or something, it may be that actually you can't do much without adding loads of JavaScript to make it work, because that's inherent to what it's doing. But it may be in some other cases that actually providing, okay, here's a good example, right? Many years ago, I don't think they do this anymore, but many years ago, Google Sheets, if you visited it with JavaScript turned off, all it displayed you was a HTML table with the data in. It wasn't interactive. There were no functions or anything like that running on it. It was literally just the static data. Now, if that's all you needed, you just needed to look at a grid of data. That's all you needed to do. And then when the JavaScript loaded, it then turned it into an actual living, breathing spreadsheet that you could start typing stuff in. It's that kind of thinking. It's about progressive enhancement. Is about, how do I start from the basis? What is the user actually trying to do? And then how do I layer on the interactivity onto that? So the question from Tim, does progressive enhancement not make bug detection difficult, since the site is designed not to fail, even if some of the underlying tech does? It can make testing more difficult, but it could also make it could also mean that if you test the simpler interaction, the simpler how do I put this? The simpler forms of your website, if you like, the basic version, and that's solid. You know that even if the stuff, as you add on more JavaScript and add on more features and things, even if that stuff fails, that basic version is still going to work. So your testing can be concentrated on the extreme end, if you like, on the more complicated use cases, and knowing that the simpler stuff is going to keep working. I probably haven't answered that question very well. Sorry about that.
From Rahul,
okay.
Chris, does application framework affect the performance of the websites?
The application framework. If you want a deep dive into the actual performance of different web frameworks, like compare Angular to React to Vue to whatever else, there are sites out there that do that kind of thing. So you'll have to go and look up those yourself. Obviously, if you're talking about server application frameworks or MVC frameworks or something like that, that's up to how you build it. Most of those things are really fast. One thing I missed out of this talk, but I've told before, is right back when web performance started becoming a thing, the guy that started looking at that, his initial investigations found out that actually 80% of performance problems happened on the front end, not on the server. So loads of people were concentrated on doing things like speeding up SQL queries, optimizing memory management on the server and all that kind of stuff. And most of the problems that actually affected users didn't happen there at all. They happened in the front end. So his quote was, most of the problems happen in the front end. Start there. Concentrate on that first to make sure that's right before you start worrying too much about, shaving milliseconds off a SQL query or something like that.
Okay. And there was a follow-up as well, Chris, there from Leslie at the bottom.
Okay, what do you say to those that argue JavaScript is now so embedded it's expected to be available? Given JavaScript is now so embedded and not a reasonable expectation, why should at least a basic running of JavaScript be expected? Okay, it's a great question, really great question. Okay, JavaScript is expected, and a lot of sites rely on it to provide kind of the whiz-bang stuff, interactivity and all that kind of stuff, and that's fine. The BBC had a really good approach to this a number of years ago, which they called cutting the mustard. Right? It's a very British phrase, isn't it? And basically, they put a little bit of JavaScript into their site that detected whether the browser was a slightly old school one or a much more modern browser, like a modern evergreen kind of browser like Chrome. And they called it cutting the mustard. And if it was one of the old ones, then basically they didn't load any JavaScript at all. You got a very static page. Now for the BBC, it's mainly static content that works quite well. But then for the stuff, for the browsers that were newer, that had those newer JavaScript APIs that the BBC wanted to use, they then kicked in all of this extra JavaScript that got loaded to provide you with all of that extra interactivity. So they had a very clear two-tier system, the basic for everybody, and then the advanced for the people that could support that stuff. So it's not about saying, well, nobody turns JavaScript off, because very few people do turn JavaScript off. Even I don't most of the time. But it is about saying, well, how could this fail? You know, what happens if I'm relying on this JavaScript or relying on the API calls this JavaScript makes? What effect does that have if it breaks? And I think, to be honest, to be really blunt, that's not even a progressive enhancement thing. That's just good engineering. You know, we should be thinking about that stuff on the front end and making sure that we're building these sites to be resilient. Hopefully that answers your question, Leslie. Thanks for it.
I think we've maybe got time for one more. If there's anybody that's got anything else to add, speak now or forever hold your peace. No, right? Well, yeah. Just a massive thank you. Oh no, we've got another one from Leslie.
Oh yeah, hey, Leslie. Oh, keen.
Leslie.
You've advocated 2 different sites depending on the user's system. This view is similar to having the mobile view and the desktop view, so largely not good. No, it's not about 2 different views. It's about one view, and then you layer stuff on that view to provide extra interactivity when it's there. For example, right, okay, here's an example, really simple example. Back in the day when border radius in CSS was only supported by some browsers, people used to put border radius into their CSS knowing that it wouldn't work in some browsers, but it would work in others. And eventually, as more browsers implemented border radius, more browsers saw the border radius on their elements. And that's a really good way that the kind of progressive nature of the web or of web technologies works. You know, because when it comes to HTML and CSS, if a browser encounters something that it doesn't understand, it just skips over it. But when it comes to JavaScript, if a browser encounters something that it doesn't understand, whether that's, you know, some modern JavaScript it doesn't understand or whatever, it will fail. It will actually throw an error and stop the script running. So there's a difference between the declarative nature of HTML and CSS and the what's the other one? Declarative. There's another one. The different nature of JavaScript. Imperative. That's it. Declarative and imperative. Imperative nature of JavaScript. So that's why we have to be particularly careful in those cases. GM codes, you're talking about failing gracefully. Kind of. Graceful degradation is like the mirror of progressive enhancement. And I would say that progressive enhancement is a better way. Start from a solid basis and build on that, rather than build the all singing, all dancing thing and then try to cater for every way that might fail. Start from the ground and build your way up. That's what I would suggest.
Right, brilliant. Well, I think that concludes then to 2 o'clock. Absolutely on the nose.
Great.
So yeah, just a big thank you, Chris. I thought that was absolutely brilliant, really informative.
Oh, thank you very much.
I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else has taken something from it. So we'll definitely get it out there for people to be available, because I think there's some great reference tools on your presentation as well, which I think people will be really interested in receiving. So yeah, big thank you, Chris, and thanks for everybody for
No
joining.
problem.
And if anybody wants to do a topic, a webinar, similar to Chris, then please message me, get me on LinkedIn. I'm all over everywhere at Fruition IT. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Excellent, thank
Cheers,
you.
everyone. Cheers.